Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So the series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, July 13th, 1861, actually July 12th, 1861, a treaty is signed between a North American government and the Choctaw and Chickasaw tribes. Now, maybe that's not notable. There were all sorts of treaties with Native Americans, but 1861... this treaty was not with the United States of America, but the Confederate States of America. As the Civil War broke out and southern states seceded from the Union, the Confederacy signed a number of treaties with Native Americans, something I will confess I didn't know that much about, and it certainly adds a new dimension to us trying to understand the shifting alliances as this country broke apart. So here to discuss the Confederate Indigenous treaties are, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia, and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So Kellie, I mean, from a large perspective, when we think about why some Native American tribes would sign treaties with the Confederacy, is this sort of a case of maybe the enemy of my enemy is my friend?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that oftentimes, it's unfortunate that we have these very singular narratives when we think about the Civil War of like the North and the South, or, free and enslaved, or white and black. And we completely forget about the fact that there are other groups of people intensely involved and invested in the outcome of this war, and that Indigenous people and Native American people are very much a part of this as well. And that there's a long history of Native Americans having to pivot according to their political affiliations or alliances. And so we see this in the American Revolution, where, Indigenous groups that become either loyalists or patriots or fight for the British. But you see this here as well in terms of Native American groups that either side with the Union or side with the Confederacy. And for those who chose to side with the Confederacy, part of that historical context comes through the Trail of Tears. It comes through the betrayal of the federal government at Indian removal. And so also it's important to note that a lot of these Native American tribes that we're going to talk about, the Cherokee and the Choctaw, were also slave owners. So it's not completely incompatible for them to side with the Confederacy because they were both involved in the practice of slavery.
I think that's a really important point. I mean, remember that for most of the 17th and 18th century, different tribes are playing empires off of one another. Mm-hmm. And so it shouldn't be a surprise that when a war breaks out in North America, that there are going to be different tribes taking different sides as they try to find an advantage in all of the white people fighting against one another, right. Because that's how they've had to navigate the geopolitics of this land for a couple hundred years by this point. And so I think what Kellie is pulling out is something that's really important, that it's not just that the enemy of my enemy is my ally, but that there are actually a few cultural connections. A lot of these tribes had been removed from the South, so they were tied to the land of the South, but they were also enslavers, and that's a tie as well.
So what do we know about the details of how these alliances came together?
So Albert Pike, who is a New Englander, and arrives to Arkansas, which becomes his adopted state. He's actually not a fan of secession when the Civil War breaks out, but he decides to, hey, I'm in Arkansas. When in Arkansas, we do as the people do. So he becomes this official to work negotiating these treaties with the Cherokee and with the Choctaw and with the Chickasaw tribes. Most notably, he's negotiating with John Ross, who is the leader of the Cherokee people in 1861. And he's trying to establish these treaties to not just define boundaries or territories, but also to sort of serve as a buffer, if you will, between Union forces. And so some of these factions work well for the Confederacy and others not so much. And part of that is because, Native Americans are not a monolith. And so they're all approaching what is in their best interest politically, whether or not they align with themselves, the North or the South.
Yeah. And not only are Indigenous peoples not a monolith because they're part of different tribes, but the tribes themselves are very divided, in part because of what Kellie was talking about earlier with the Trail of Tears. Within the Cherokee Nation, there had been treaties signed illegally by people who weren't the leaders of the tribe. And so there had been these divisions that were ripping these groups apart, and they were working out a lot of those divisions and fights over leadership in their negotiations with the Confederacy and with the U.S. And so there's a lot of politics at play, and they don't all involve what's going on with the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And a number of these treaties do seem at their heart to have what I think a lot of treaties between Native Americans and the federal government had, which was kind of a please leave us alone element at the heart of it. But it actually sometimes goes a little beyond that, which I think is fascinating too, where now, in signing a treaty with the Confederate States of America, they were breaking treaties and breaking formal ties with the North, with the federal government. And some of the tribes started to then also send representatives to the Confederate Congress. There were
serving in the war. I mean, there's over 7,000 Native American people that fight for the Confederacy. There's about 20,000 Indigenous people that fight during the Civil War. But 7,000 of them are fighting for the Confederacy. And that sort of baffled my mind to think of the idea of Native troops out fighting on behalf of a slaveholding South.
And sometimes fighting other Native troops who were fighting for the U.S. This is especially true in Indian Territory and what would become Oklahoma. There's a vacuum of leadership in the Indian Territory because when the war breaks out, the U.S. calls home all of the soldiers that they had who were at forts in Indian Territory, and they're like, come back and fight in this big war we're having. And the Confederacy sees that, and they're like, oh, we're going to send our troops there so that we can make these pacts, but also so that we can control this land. And so eventually you get something called the Home Guard, which are Indigenous troops who are fighting for the U.S. who are now in, there's kind of a civil war within Indigenous peoples themselves as they fight over that territory during the war.
So just to draw some clear lines, so the Chickasaw and the Choctaw are readily embracing the Confederacy, and members of their tribe are embracing ideas of the Confederacy. But the Creek and the Seminole are sort of divided, and so a lot of these tribes are in tension over who is going to side with the Union or the Confederacy. It's not an even split, but it gives you an idea of where some alliances lie.
Let's talk a little bit about the aftermath of all this. First off, I think there was a story about, as you were getting at, Niki, a story about the way in which the Civil War tore Native regions and communities and tribes apart in a way that I think, often throughout the history of this country, you can just turn to the effect on Native Americans and say, this was perhaps the most tragic outcome of all. But then also, after the Civil War is done and the North prevails, these treaties need to get unwound. There's new negotiations with the Union. I mean, there's a whole new procedural fallout as well.
Yeah, there is. I mean, one little story we should tell as we get to the end of the Civil War. It was actually a Cherokee general who was fighting for the Confederacy, who was the last Confederate general to surrender in the Civil War. So that gives you a sense of how dogged and determined, in many ways, the indigenous Confederate Alliance was. But yeah, so now it's a matter of figuring out what to do with all of these broken treaties. Not that broken treaties are anything new to U.S. indigenous relations, but they're kind of null and void after these tribes aligned with the Confederacy. And so they sign new ones. One of the ones they sign in 1866 with the Choctaw Nation includes a provision that says that the Choctaw have to end slavery, which is something that they had not yet done until that point.
Yeah, the Choctaw actually keep slavery until about 1866, which is a year after the Civil War ends. And I don't think people realize how long slavery persisted, especially among indigenous nations.
And this also sets the stage for something that we have talked about in the show before, which is Oklahoma statehood, that there is an intense focus now on Oklahoma and on renegotiating those treaties to be favorable toward the U.S., which then allows for Indian Territory to ultimately be converted into a U.S. state.
Yeah. Which I think, is worth pointing out that a number of times we've talked about the Civil War and tried to sort of, to your point, Kellie, make it, point out that's much more complex than just north, south, black, white, slave holders. And the westward expansion and new territory in the West and the slavery question there added in with this dimension of Indian territory and Native American treaties. I mean, we start to get a real sense of how complex and nuanced and layered this all was. So as we start to wrap up here, I'm curious if you see any of this. I mean, we've been sort of talking about how this is hidden in history, but there are some echoes of it still popping up from time to time, including a notable statue.
So I think it's important to note, as we discussed earlier at the start of this episode, that Albert Pike, who is the New Englander who settles in Arkansas and is responsible for making all of these treaties, Confederate treaties with Native American tribes, has a statue of him erected in Washington, D.C. in 1901. And during the racial reckoning of last year, the summer of 2020, protesters targeted that statue and tore it down and set it on fire. So clearly there are people who are aware of this complicated history and the role that Pike played.
I am interested to know if they sort of really understood this dimension that we're discussing here, or if it was just, a Confederate
He's a Confederate,
statue.
good enough for me.
Right.
I also will confess, I don't know how you set a statue on fire.
Pretty impressive.
Yeah, we'll have to go back and look at that. But yes, so Albert Pike still popping up in history, even to this moment. Okay, let's leave it there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. You can get in touch with us with any questions or comments or ideas for the show. Email us thisdaypod@gmail.com, or you can find a form at thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.